Father Francis here, kind of doing something a little different today. Yeah, okay, we're using two different cameras here. We're using an iPhone 6 Plus here, and we're using the GoPro over here. I'm going to try and just see how this is going to look in post. So I have no idea what this is going to look like here. So now I'm kind of doing a spin over here. And so anyway, I'm just kind of having a little bit of fun with some different tools as I make my videos. So I thought I got a summons here. Oops, I got to go into here the kitchen. Let's see if that's the living room here. Maybe you can see behind me now. This is the kitchen, and I am now going to be going right over here to the old oven. If I can get that other camera maybe working there through the oven. And we are going to get out tonight's dinner, which happens to be some baked salmon. So let me turn this off here real quick. Put these down here real quick here. Maybe you can keep that one there. Turn the oven off. There we go. Is that off? Oops. That's on. Off. Hope that's off. Okay. Looks like that's off. Sure hope so. Okay. Well, today I thought it was kind of fitting to show you my dinner because it's fish. And the gospel tonight is about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Now, scholars tell us that it actually was more than 5,000. More than 5,000. Can you believe that? Because you add the spouses and the children, and you could have easily over, say, at least 15,000. Count them. 15,000 people plus. Okay? So it's more than 5,000. So now the reason why I want to focus not so much on that number per se, but I do want us to focus on the reality of hungry people that Jesus is about to feed. But more than that, believe it or not, I think there's something really interesting going on here. It isn't just another random miracle. You know, it's not, Jesus is, just kind of, in the daily course of just doing his ministry, well, I guess I'll go ahead and feed these people. I mean, he's going to do that for a specific reason, I believe, but there's a lot more going on here, and that's what I would like to just kind of talk about today. The first thing that I think is really interesting about this particular gospel is that Jesus, he goes to this mountain, this kind of deserted place in some ways, and what does he do? What's the very first thing he does with his disciples? He sits down. That's right. He sits down, and you're probably saying, what does that got to do with anything? Well, you see, I think it has a lot to do with it. I think it's a very telling posture, if you will, because when Jewish rabbis teach, they would always teach from the sitting position. And so we're told very deliberately that Jesus sat down and he began to, again, talk to his disciples. What he was really about to do was he was about to teach them a lesson. That's right. Because what is happening is he realizes, that these people have come to see him, hear his teachings, the larger crowd. And so he realizes that, hey, they're human beings. We get hungry as human beings. I know that it's about, let's see here, if you can see if I can do a little backup here. I'm kind of doing a little thing here. Can we see what time it is on the wall there? Well, it's almost 5 o'clock. It's getting close to 5 o'clock. Or is it? Yeah, it's getting close to 5 o'clock there. Okay. So, I have been, let's just say I haven't had anything to eat all day. Have had some water and some delicious cold brewed coffee. By the way, if you've never had cold brewed coffee, let me encourage you. Simplest thing in the world to do. What you do is you get yourself a French press and get some ground coffee, put in some nice cold filtered water, and let it sit for 12 hours, and then you plunge it from the French press, and man, I'll tell you what, Nothing better in the whole wide world, especially in hot days today, like today. Cold, fresh, French press coffee is a real treat. Okay, so getting back to the lesson here. So Jesus has them, he sits down, he has the disciples sit down, and so he says, let's give them something to eat. Now this is interesting because Jesus identifies a problem kind of before the disciples really catch on to, we got a logistics problem here. Okay? So he realizes that we're going to have to feed these people, but the teaching comes in this. He asks them, he says, you give them something to eat. And he said this, it says, in order to test them. Now, what is the test that's going on here? Well, I want to say a couple of things about this interesting test. The first thing is Jesus knows who he is, and he is, of course, the bread of life. And he wants to see if the disciples are beginning to kind of slowly figure out what's going on here. Now, I know some scholars like to say that this is not so much a miracle in the fact that Jesus, magically waved his hands over the bread and the fish and it all magically multiplied. It was actually people sharing their lunch. Well, I'm not 100% sure that that's an accurate exegesis of the text. I'm not going to say that it didn't happen that way, but I prefer to believe that it is truly a miraculous thing. However, favorite coordinating conjunction here, there is a human agency in this where the sharing is part of that, and I will explain a little bit more of that in just a moment. But so Jesus asks them, in order to test them, it says, well, what do you have? And I think this is really, really telling, because what happens with the disciples, and it happens with us, is we look at the problem and we fail to see our solution, who, i.e. God, is in our midst. And I think that's really important, because what do the disciples do? Well, what they don't do is they don't put their faith, of course, in Jesus, again, who is, hint, 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 the bread of life. The bread of life. Did I say that? Bread of life. Okay. So you got that. He's the bread of life. Got it? Okay, good. Okay. So yes, Jesus is the bread of life. And so he's going to ask them, what do you have? Not what you don't have, but what do you have? In fact, it's interesting because they say, well, all we have is this lacking. We only have a few loaves and a few fish, and that's it. They're looking at what they don't have. And Jesus specifically asks them, what do you have? In other words, don't focus on what you don't have. What do you have? In other words, you have something. I think that's important. You and I always have something. God has given us many, many gifts. So don't look at what you don't have. Look at what you do have. And then the second thing I think is really, really, really interesting, and this is what we do a lot, is that we look at the problem. We really don't look at the solution. But when we finally look at the solution, you know what we try to solve it with? We try to solve it with a secular answer. They recognize, or they focus on what they don't have, right? And instead of realizing what they have and who they really have is Jesus, who is the bread of life. That was I think the lesson Jesus was kind of hoping that they were going to get. But the other problem is that they focus on, well, gosh, we have a problem here. Yeah, okay, now you're aware of the problem. But now it's almost funny when you stop and think about it. It's like, okay, we realize that we have this huge problem, and money isn't really, we don't have really the money to deal with it, yet we recognize that the answer is money. We don't have enough wages to buy enough food for this problem. And again, this is where it becomes very, very fascinating, is that Jesus is like just waiting to see, okay, obviously they don't get it. They don't have a clue. Can you say obtuse? I knew you could. And so he basically says, okay, guys, just bring me what you have. And kind of like a dad who's kind of hoping that maybe the kids have finally figured it out and kind of they're going to get it. They're going to, and kind of impress dad and say, hey, look what we figured out on our own. Yeah, look what we figured out. They didn't quite get it. But that's okay because Jesus is now going to take what they have. Again, I emphasize what they have. And he's going to, again, he is going to multiply that. Okay? And he does. He does multiply it. Now, here's the other thing about human agency. Again, some of the modern day exegesis is that, well, they shared the food. Well, yeah, there is a sense that now Jesus has miraculously provided for everyone's needs. And so, but it's going to require the human agency of the apostles, the disciples, to now put this miracle into reality, to practice. In other words, bring it forth. And I kind of think that's the way it is with the church, believe it or not. God helps us. He gives us the sacramental life, the spiritual life. And but now it's up to us in some ways to be that human agency to take it now to the people who are truly hungering for what Jesus longs to provide. So, again, I think that's kind of the lesson, even for us today, when we look at, what does Jesus want us to do? And I would say in some ways that in our lives, when we get into an interesting patch in our lives, it's sort of like those patches, where maybe we find ourselves in a new job. Maybe we find ourselves in a new relationship. Maybe we find ourselves in some kind of a new situation and we're kind of wondering, well, what's going on here with this? Well, chances are, just like the disciples, they come to this place and Jesus sits down. And it's a time for learning. It's a time for, it's experiencing a new lesson in life. So, many ways, again, this is a wonderful, as you used to say in the seminary, it's a teachable moment. We used to get sick of that and gag, teachable moment. And maybe some of you are familiar with that little cliche. It's a teachable moment. But in many ways, it truly is a teachable moment. And the thing is, I think we have to maybe be on the lookout for these marvelous teachable moments in our lives. And so today, I hope that, whatever it is, if you're called to provide for the needs of others, if you're called to share a meal with somebody, if you're called to help somebody recognize what they have and not what they don't have, if you're called to help people, recognize that solutions to their most difficult problems probably aren't going to be able to be solved with money, but again, it's going to be at the intervention of God and prayer. So again, I hope you got something out of that this week. Again, kind of a completely different little bit of a format that I'm working with here with the dual, cameras, and I'm going to see how this looks in post. So again, thanks for watching. And again, I want to say thank you to all of you who are viewers on an ongoing basis. Be nice to hear a comment, like and subscribe if you're kind of visiting for the first time. So again, this is Father Francis saying, we'll talk to you soon. God bless.